a warehouse on the Lower East Side, Manhattan. It was 9:32 p.m. on Wednesday, March 20th, 1935, when the 10 remaining survivors of Al Capone's 17-man assassination squad gathered in a space controlled by associates of Lucky Luciano to discuss the growing realization that their mission to kill Bumpy Johnson was proving far more difficult and far more deadly than anyone in Chicago had anticipated, with 7 of their colleagues already dead within 1 week of arriving in New York, killed through a combination of ambushes, coordinated attacks, and intelligence gathering that none of the 10 survivors had encountered in decades of working for the Chicago outfit. Antonio Tony the Blade, Ricci, 38, Charles Charlie Boxcar, Morgan, 42, Giovanni Johnny the Hammer Rossini, 33, Marco the Mauler Bellini, 39, Salvatore Sally Gunshots Romano, 31, Edward Eddie the Torch Gallagher, 35, Francis Frankie Bones Morello, 40, Leonard Lenny the Ape Caruso, 37, Vincent Vinnie Deadeye Scarpetti, 34, and Albert Albie the Rat DeLuca, 29, represented what Chicago believed was 1% of the outfit's total enforcement capacity, but a much higher percentage of its most experienced and successful assassins, men who'd collectively killed more than 100 people in the service of Al Capone's criminal empire, men who'd survived the bloody beer wars and the brutal internal conflicts that had characterized Chicago's underworld throughout the 1920s and early 30s, men who should have been capable of overwhelming any single target regardless of how well protected or how dangerous that target might be. But as the 10 men sat in the warehouse reviewing everything they'd learned about Bumpy Johnson over the previous week, sharing information about their failed reconnaissance efforts, discussing the disturbing reality that every person in Harlem seemed to know they were looking for Johnson and seemed to be actively working to prevent them from locating him, a consensus emerged that fundamentally challenged their understanding of how assassination operations were supposed to work. The target wasn't hiding, wasn't running, wasn't showing any signs of fear or desperation despite knowing that 10 professional killers were hunting him, which suggested either that Johnson was suicidally confident or, more frighteningly, that he had resources and capabilities that made him genuinely dangerous, despite operating in a relatively small neighborhood that should have been easy for outside operators to penetrate and control. Harlem, New York. It was 11:47 post-meridium on Thursday, March 14, 1935, when the first of Al Capone's 17 hired killers stepped off the 20th Century Limited at Grand Central Terminal, carrying nothing but a leather suitcase, a loaded .45 caliber pistol concealed beneath his wool overcoat, and instructions that had been delivered to him personally by Frank Nitti in a smoke-filled back room of the Lexington Hotel in Chicago exactly 72 hours earlier. Kill Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, the man they call Bumpy, the upstart Harlem numbers runner who had the audacity to publicly humiliate one of Al Capone's most trusted couriers during a cash collection dispute at the Cotton Club 2 weeks prior, or don't bother coming back to Chicago alive. The man who stepped onto the platform that Thursday night, Vincent Knuckles Moretti, 34 years old in March 1935, was a professional killer who'd worked for the Chicago outfit since 1926, who'd personally carried out at least 19 confirmed murders for Capone's organization, who'd survived the violent beer wars of the late 1920s through a combination of ruthless efficiency and an almost supernatural ability to anticipate ambushes, and who had never failed to complete an assignment in 9 years of working for the most powerful crime syndicate in America. What Moretti didn't know, what none of the 17 men Al Capone sent to New York between March 14th and March 20th, 1935 knew, was that they were walking into a trap more sophisticated and more deadly than anything Capone's organization had ever encountered, orchestrated by a Harlem gangster whose intelligence, street networks, and tactical brilliance would cost the Chicago outfit 16 men, millions of dollars in lost prestige, and the permanent end of any dreams Capone harbored of expanding his empire into Harlem's lucrative numbers rackets. The conflict that led to Capone sending 17 assassins to kill Bumpy Johnson began innocuously enough on Saturday, February 23, 1935, at the Cotton Club on West 142nd Street and Lenox Avenue, the legendary Harlem nightclub that catered to wealthy white patrons who came uptown to hear Duke Ellington's orchestra to watch the most beautiful black dancers and performers in New York, and to engage in the kind of illicit activities, gambling, bootleg liquor, despite the ongoing prohibition, prostitution, that made Harlem simultaneously dangerous and irresistible to Manhattan's elite seeking thrills they couldn't find in their respectable downtown neighborhoods. On that particular Saturday evening, the Cotton Club was hosting a special performance by Cab Calloway and his orchestra, and the club was packed with more than 400 patrons, including several minor celebrities, business executives, politicians, and members of various criminal organizations who had come to enjoy the entertainment and to conduct the kind of business that required neutral territory where multiple gangs could gather without immediate violence. Among the patrons that evening was Anthony Big Tony Marcello, 41 years old in February 1935, a Chicago outfit enforcer who served as one of Capone's most reliable couriers for transporting cash between Chicago and various East Coast operations, and who had traveled to New York carrying approximately $75,000 in cash that Capone was investing in a bootlegging partnership with Lucky Luciano, the rising star of New York's Italian crime families, who controlled most of Manhattan's organized criminal activities outside of Harlem.
Marcello was supposed to deliver the cash to one of Luciano's representatives at a prearranged location, but he decided to stop at the Cotton Club first, partly because he'd heard Cab Calloway was performing and wanted to see the famous bandleader in person, partly because he enjoyed the exotic appeal of Harlem's nightlife, and partly because Big Tony Marcello was an arrogant man who believed his association with Al Capone made him untouchable anywhere in America, immune to the kind of street-level criminal activity that might threaten lesser men who foolishly carried large amounts of cash through dangerous neighborhoods.
Marcello sat at a table near the stage drinking bootleg whiskey that cost 3 times what it would have cost in a Chicago speakeasy, watching the dancers perform, making crude comments about the black women on stage that were loud enough to be overheard by neighboring tables, and generally behaving like a man who owned the place, despite being a guest in territory that belonged to neither Capone nor Luciano, but rather to the various black gangsters who controlled Harlem's indigenous criminal operations, most notably Stephanie St. Clair, the legendary Madam Queen who ran the numbers rackets, and her most dangerous enforcer, the man who would soon become the greatest threat Al Capone never anticipated, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy Johnson was at the Cotton Club that Saturday night, according to 7 witnesses who spoke with the Harlem Observer between February 25th and March 2nd, 1935, not because he particularly enjoyed the performances that the club staged primarily for white audiences, but because he was meeting with several of his own associates to discuss protection arrangements for numbers operations in the western sections of Harlem, territories where Dutch Schultz, the violent and unpredictable Jewish gangster who was attempting to muscle into Harlem's gambling businesses, had been making aggressive incursions that threatened Madame St. Clair's empire and required Bumpy's tactical response. Johnson, 29 years old in February 1935, was already developing the reputation that would eventually make him the most powerful black gangster in American history, a man whose intelligence was matched only by his willingness to use extreme violence when necessary, who had killed at least 12 men by that point in his career, who had survived multiple assassination attempts by Dutch Schultz's organization, and who was fiercely protective of Harlem as territory that belonged to black gangsters and that should not be surrendered to white criminals from downtown Manhattan or Chicago or anywhere else, regardless of how powerful those organizations might be. The confrontation between Marcello and Johnson occurred at approximately 1:15 ante-meridiem on Sunday, February 24, 1935, according to witnesses present in the Cotton Club that night. Marcello, who was drunk by that point, having consumed at least 8 glasses of whiskey over the course of 4 hours, according to estimates from the bartender who served him, decided he wanted to use the men's restroom, which was located near the back of the club, past the tables where Bumpy Johnson and his associates were conducting their meeting. As Marcello walked toward the restroom, his gait unsteady from alcohol consumption, he accidentally bumped into the back of the chair where William "Bub" Hewlett, 38 years old in February 1935, one of Bumpy's most trusted lieutenants and a notorious street fighter who had been working with Johnson since the late 1920s, was sitting. The collision was minor, barely enough to jostle Hewlett's chair, but Marcello, instead of apologizing or simply continuing to the restroom, made a comment that witnesses described as both racist and deliberately provocative. "Watch where you put your chair," he reportedly said, his voice loud enough to be heard by everyone at nearby tables. "This ain't your club, it's white folks' club, and you colored boys are just the entertainment. You should show more respect to your betters." According to Rebecca Hartford, 42 years old in February 1935, a Cotton Club waitress who witnessed the confrontation and who spoke with the Observer on February 25th, the atmosphere at Bumpy Johnson's table changed instantly from casual business discussion to deadly tension. Hewlett stood up, his hand moving toward the knife he always carried, but before he could respond to Marcello's insult, Bumpy put a hand on Hewlett's arm and said, in a voice that witnesses described as calm and almost friendly, despite the underlying menace everyone present could detect, "Let me handle this." Bumpy then addressed Marcello directly, with elaborate politeness that made the insult he was about to deliver even more cutting. "Sir, I believe you're confused about where you are. This is Harlem, not Chicago. And in Harlem, we don't tolerate disrespect from visitors, especially drunk visitors who don't know enough to mind their manners when they're in someone else's territory. I suggest you apologize to my friend, finish your business here, and catch the next train back to whatever sewer you crawled out of." What happened next, according to multiple witnesses, was a display of arrogance and stupidity that would ultimately cost Marcello his life, cost Al Capone 16 of his best men, and permanently end any chance of the Chicago outfit expanding operations into Harlem. Marcello, apparently not recognizing Bumpy Johnson, apparently not understanding the danger he was in, apparently believing that his association with Capone made him immune to consequences in any American city, laughed in Bumpy's face and said, "According to witnesses, you threatening me? You know who I work for? I work for Al Capone, the most powerful man in America. He owns half of Chicago. He's got judges and cops and politicians in his pocket. He's killed more men than you've probably even met. You're just some Harlem street punk running numbers for colored folks. If Al Capone wanted this whole neighborhood shut down tomorrow, he could make it happen with one phone call. So why don't you sit down, keep your mouth shut, and be grateful I don't have my boss send some real gangsters up here to teach you people your place?" The silence that followed Marcello's statement was, according to witnesses, absolute and terrifying. The band continued playing, the dancers continued performing on stage, but at the tables surrounding Bumpy Johnson's position, everyone stopped talking, stopped drinking, stopped moving, waiting to see how Johnson would respond to being threatened, insulted, and publicly disrespected by a Chicago gangster who had just made the catastrophic mistake of invoking Al Capone's name as if it carried weight in territory that Bumpy Johnson considered his to protect. Bumpy stood up slowly, walked around the table until he was standing directly in front of Marcello, close enough that Marcello could smell the cologne Bumpy always wore, close enough that witnesses could see the expression on Bumpy's face, which several people described as a smile that was more frightening than any display of anger could have been, and said in a voice that was conversational and almost gentle, despite the words he was speaking, "Tell you what, since you work for such a powerful man, since Al Capone is so important and so dangerous, I'm going to give you a choice. You can apologize to my friend right now for bumping into his chair and insulting him, and I'll let you leave here with all your fingers and all your teeth. Or you can continue being disrespectful, and I'll take the $75,000 I know you're carrying in that suitcase, the money you're supposed to deliver to Lucky Luciano's people tonight, and I'll send it back to Al Capone with a message explaining that Harlem isn't Chicago, and that if he wants to do business in New York, he needs to teach his people how to show respect to the local operators." How Bumpy knew about the cash Marcello was carrying, how Bumpy knew about the deal between Capone and Luciano, has been a subject of speculation among organized crime historians for decades. According to Theodore Green, the Harlem attorney who later represented Johnson in various legal matters and who spoke with the Observer on March 18, 1935, Bumpy maintained an intelligence network throughout New York that rivaled anything the police or the federal government had developed. Bumpy had sources in every major hotel, every major nightclub, every train station, every important location where gangsters might gather or conduct business. When Big Tony Marcello checked into the Teresa Hotel on January 22nd, carrying a heavy suitcase and asking questions about how to get to the Cotton Club, Bumpy's network reported it within hours. When Marcello met with one of Luciano's representatives at a restaurant on January 23rd to confirm the delivery schedule, Bumpy's sources overheard the conversation and reported the details. By the time Marcello walked into the Cotton Club on February 23rd, Bumpy already knew who he was, how much money he was carrying, who he worked for, what his business in New York involved, and most importantly, how arrogant and careless Marcello was, which made him an ideal target for the kind of public humiliation that Bumpy used to establish his authority and to send messages to other organizations about the cost of disrespecting Harlem's indigenous gangsters. Marcello, confronted with Bumpy's knowledge about the cash and the deal with Luciano, and confronted with the fact that he was surrounded by Bumpy's associates in a club where he had no backup and no protection, made what witnesses described as an extremely poor decision. He reached inside his coat, apparently intending to draw the pistol he carried in a shoulder holster, apparently believing he could threaten or even shoot Bumpy and escape the situation through violence. He never got the gun clear of the holster. According to witnesses, Bumpy moved with speed that seemed impossible for a man who'd been standing casually just seconds before, grabbed Marcello's wrist before the gun was fully drawn, twisted Marcello's arm behind his back with enough force that witnesses heard bones crack, and simultaneously kicked Marcello's legs out from under him, sending the Chicago enforcer crashing face-first onto the Cotton Club's polished wooden floor. The entire sequence, from Marcello reaching for his gun to Marcello lying on the floor with a broken wrist and a shattered nose, took less than 3 seconds, according to witnesses who watched the confrontation unfold. What happened next, according to multiple witnesses who spoke with the Observer in the days following the incident, was a display of calculated humiliation that demonstrated Bumpy Johnson's understanding that power in the criminal underworld wasn't just about violence, but about perception, reputation, and the willingness to publicly destroy anyone who challenged your authority in ways that other gangsters would hear about and remember. Bumpy ordered his associates to search Marcello, and they removed the pistol, removed the leather suitcase containing the $75,000 in cash, removed Marcello's wallet containing his identification and additional cash, removed even Marcello's expensive watch and diamond ring, leaving the Chicago enforcer lying on the floor with nothing but his clothing and his injuries. Bumpy then addressed the entire Cotton Club, speaking loudly enough that everyone in the venue, patrons, performers, staff, could hear every word he said. "This man," Bumpy announced, pointing at Marcello, who was struggling to sit up despite his broken wrist and bleeding nose, came to Harlem representing Al Capone, representing Chicago, and he thought that meant he could disrespect the people who actually live here, the people who actually run things here, the people who've built these businesses and protected these neighborhoods, while Chicago gangsters were still trying to figure out how to run speakeasies without killing each other every week. He thought Al Capone's name would protect him in Harlem. He was wrong. I'm taking his money, all $75,000 that Capone sent him to deliver to Lucky Luciano, and I'm keeping it as payment for the disrespect he showed to my people, and I'm sending him back to Chicago with a message for Al Capone. Harlem isn't for sale, Harlem isn't part of your empire, and if Al Capone has a problem with that, he's welcome to come to Harlem personally and discuss it with me. Until then, any of Capone's people who come to this neighborhood better show proper respect, or they'll end up like this fool, beaten, robbed, and humiliated in front of 400 witnesses. Bumpy then had his associates drag Marcello out of the Cotton Club and dump him on the sidewalk outside, where he was discovered approximately 20 minutes later by a police officer who called an ambulance to transport him to Harlem Hospital for treatment of his injuries. According to hospital records obtained by the Observer, Marcello was treated for a broken wrist, a fractured nose, 2 broken ribs from where he'd hit the floor, multiple contusions, and what the attending physician described as extreme psychological distress, manifesting as incoherent rambling about revenge and what would happen when his boss found out what had happened to him. Marcello was released from the hospital on February 25th, immediately took a train back to Chicago, and according to sources within the Chicago outfit who spoke with the Observer on condition of anonymity, arrived at the Lexington Hotel on February 26th, looking like he'd been beaten with a baseball bat, still wearing the same clothes he'd been wearing at the Cotton Club because Bumpy's people had stolen everything else, including his suitcase and his money, and carrying a message that he was terrified to deliver but that he knew would result in his death if he tried to conceal it. Al Capone needed to know that a Harlem gangster named Bumpy Johnson had robbed him of $75,000, had publicly humiliated one of his top enforcers, and had sent a message that Chicago had no authority in Harlem and should stay out of New York's black neighborhoods if Capone valued the lives of his men. Wednesday, February 27th, 1935. You're telling me some colored gangster in Harlem took my money and disrespected my organization. Al Capone, 36 years old in February 1935, was already past the peak of his power by that point in his criminal career, though he remained the most feared and most recognized gangster in America, a man whose organization controlled illegal alcohol, gambling, prostitution, and various other criminal enterprises throughout Chicago and the Midwest, a man who'd ordered the deaths of hundreds of rivals during the beer wars of the late 1920s. a man whose name was synonymous with organized crime at a level that made him simultaneously famous and despised, celebrated in some circles and hunted by federal agents who'd finally found a way to prosecute him through tax evasion charges that would ultimately send him to prison in 1932, though in February 1935 he was still nominally in control of the Chicago outfit despite the increasing attention from law enforcement. Capone listened to Marcello's account of what had happened at the Cotton Club with an expression that witnesses later described as frighteningly calm, the kind of calm that anyone who knew Capone recognized as more dangerous than any display of rage. Because when Al Capone was calm in the face of disrespect or betrayal, it meant he was already planning exactly how he would destroy whoever had crossed him. According to Frank Nitti, who was present during the meeting when Marcello reported the Cotton Club incident and who spoke with associates who later provided information to the Observer in March 1935, Capone asked Marcello to repeat the story 3 times, asking specific questions about Bumpy Johnson, about how many men were with him, about whether Marcello had any opportunity to fight back or escape, about the exact words Bumpy had used when sending his message to Capone. When Marcello finished his 3rd recounting of the incident, Capone dismissed him from the office, then turned to Nitti and the other senior members of the Chicago outfit who were present and said, according to multiple sources, this Harlem gangster, this Bumpy Johnson, just made the biggest mistake of his life. Nobody robs Al Capone. Nobody disrespects the Chicago outfit. Nobody sends me messages telling me I don't have authority in any American city. I don't care if he's in Harlem or Timbuktu, I'm going to send a message back that'll make every gangster in America understand what happens when you steal from me. I want Johnson dead. I want him killed in a way that's public and brutal enough that every other upstart criminal in every other city knows better than to even think about crossing Al Capone. The decision to send not one assassin, not a small team, but 17 separate killers to murder Bumpy Johnson was, according to organized crime historians who later studied the incident, both a demonstration of how seriously Capone took the disrespect and a catastrophic miscalculation based on Capone's fundamental misunderstanding of Harlem, of Bumpy Johnson's capabilities, and of the territorial advantages that Johnson possessed in his home neighborhood that would nullify every advantage Capone's organization normally enjoyed through superior numbers and firepower. Capone, according to sources who spoke with the Observer, believed that sending 17 professional killers to Harlem over the course of 1 week would guarantee Johnson's death through sheer probability. Even if Johnson managed to kill or evade the first few assassins, Capone reasoned, eventually one of them would get lucky, would catch Johnson off guard, would complete the assignment, and restore Capone's reputation. What Capone failed to understand, what none of his advisors apparently explained to him because few people in Chicago understood the unique nature of Harlem's criminal landscape in 1935, was that Bumpy Johnson wasn't a typical gangster who could be ambushed in a vulnerable moment. Johnson was protected by an entire community of people who saw him as a defender against outside criminal organizations, who would warn him about suspicious white men asking questions about his whereabouts, who would report to Johnson's network the moment any of Capone's assassins arrived in Harlem, giving Johnson advance warning and the opportunity to prepare responses that would turn each assassination attempt into an opportunity to destroy Capone's men and to reinforce Johnson's reputation as someone who could outsmart and outfight the most powerful crime organization in America. The 17 men Capone selected to kill Bumpy Johnson were, according to Chicago outfit records that later became available to historians, among the most experienced and successful assassins in Capone's organization, men who had collectively killed more than 100 people in the service of Chicago's criminal empire, men who had survived the violent beer wars and the brutal internal conflicts that had characterized organized crime in Chicago throughout the 1920s and early 30s. The men were sent to New York in small groups, arriving on different trains on different days between March 14th and March 20th, 1935, each man traveling under a false name, each man carrying different weapons ranging from pistols to shotguns to knives to even brass knuckles for close-quarters combat, each man having been briefed separately by Frank Nitti about Bumpy Johnson's appearance, known associates, favorite locations, and behavioral patterns that Capone's intelligence network had gathered through sources in New York, though, as events would prove, Capone's intelligence was both outdated and incomplete compared to the real-time information Johnson's own network provided about every movement the Chicago assassins made from the moment they arrived in New York. Vincent "Knuckles" Moretti was the first to arrive, stepping off the 20th Century Limited at Grand Central Terminal at 11:47 post-meridium on Thursday, March 14, 1935, carrying his leather suitcase and his loaded pistol and his instructions from Frank Nitti, completely unaware that within 47 minutes of his arrival in New York, Bumpy Johnson already knew he was in the city, knew which hotel he'd checked into, the Teresa Hotel on 7th Avenue, knew that he'd asked the desk clerk about locations where a man might find Ellsworth Johnson for a business discussion, and knew that Moretti was almost certainly one of multiple assassins Capone would be sending in response to the Cotton Club humiliation. According to William "Bub" Hewlett, who spoke with The Observer on March 28, 1935, Bumpy received the first report about Moretti's arrival at approximately 12:30 ante-meridium on Friday, March 15th, from a porter at Grand Central Terminal who'd been on Johnson's payroll for 6 years and who reported any suspicious characters asking questions about Harlem or about specific individuals in the neighborhood. The porter described a white man in his 30s, well-dressed but nervous, carrying himself like a professional criminal rather than a tourist or businessman, asking about how to get to Harlem and whether the porter knew anything about a man called Bumpy Johnson. The porter gave Moretti directions to the Teresa Hotel, wished him well, and immediately called a phone number that connected him to one of Bumpy's associates, reporting the suspicious inquiry and providing a physical description of the man who'd been asking questions. By 1:30 ante-meridium on March 15th, Bumpy had assembled 8 of his most trusted men at his office above a grocery store on Lenox Avenue, had reviewed the information about Moretti's arrival, and had developed a plan for dealing with what he correctly assumed would be the first of multiple assassination attempts sent by Al Capone. Bumpy's plan, according to associates who were present during the planning session, was brilliant in its simplicity and its psychological impact. Instead of hiding from Capone's assassins, instead of trying to avoid locations where they might find him, Bumpy decided to actively hunt each assassin as they arrived in Harlem, using his superior knowledge of the neighborhood and his extensive network of informants to locate them before they could locate him, and then to kill them in ways that would send clear messages back to Capone about the futility of trying to assassinate someone in their home territory, where every resident, every business owner, every street corner hustler was a potential source of intelligence and early warning. The death of Vincent Moretti occurred at approximately 4:15 ante-meridium on Friday, March 15, 1935, less than 5 hours after he arrived in New York, in an alley behind the Teresa Hotel, where Moretti had been lured by one of Bumpy's associates pretending to be a prostitute offering services. According to witnesses who discovered the body later that morning, Moretti had been shot once in the back of the head at close range, execution style, and had been stripped of all identification, all weapons, and all money, leaving nothing that would help police identify him or connect him to the Chicago outfit or to the broader conflict between Capone and Johnson. The body was discovered at approximately 7:20 ante-meridium by a hotel porter who reported the murder to police, triggering a homicide investigation that went nowhere because nobody in Harlem admitted to knowing anything about who the dead white man was or why he'd been killed in that particular alley. According to Theodore Green, Bumpy made sure the body would be discovered in a location where police would investigate, because Johnson wanted Capone to eventually learn that his assassins were dying, but Johnson didn't want to make it too easy or too obvious, preferring instead to let Capone gradually realize that every man sent to kill Bumpy Johnson was vanishing in Harlem without a trace, creating psychological pressure and uncertainty that would be more damaging to Capone's reputation than any single act of violence could achieve. The second and third assassins arrived together on Friday evening, March 15, 1935. James "Jimmy the Knife" DeMarco, 40 years old, and Patrick "Paddy Fists" O'Brien, 37 years old, both experienced Chicago enforcers who'd worked together for Capone since the late 1920s, checked into a boarding house on 135th Street at approximately 8:30 post-meridium, asking the landlady if she knew where they might find a man named Bumpy Johnson, explaining that they were businessmen from Chicago, interested in discussing potential opportunities with Mr. Johnson, a story that the landlady pretended to believe while mentally composing the phone call she would make to one of Johnson's associates within minutes of the two men heading upstairs to their room. DeMarco and O'Brien were experienced enough to take precautions, according to later analysis by organized crime historians. They didn't sleep in the same room they'd rented, instead taking positions in a vacant room across the hall where they could watch the door to their official room and ambush anyone who tried to attack them during the night. They took turns sleeping so that one of them would always be awake and alert. They positioned their weapons, a shotgun and 2 pistols, within easy reach. They did everything professional assassins were supposed to do to protect themselves in unfamiliar territory while waiting for an opportunity to locate and kill their target. What DeMarco and O'Brien didn't account for, what they couldn't have accounted for given their lack of familiarity with Harlem and with Bumpy Johnson's methods, was that Johnson had no intention of attacking them in the boarding house. According to Hewlett, Bumpy's philosophy was never to fight on ground the enemy had prepared, never to attack when the enemy expected attack, and never to take unnecessary risks when patience and superior intelligence could create opportunities for easy kills that required minimal exposure. Bumpy knew where DeMarco and O'Brien were staying. Bumpy knew they were watching their room. Bumpy knew they would be alert and dangerous at night. So Bumpy did nothing on Friday night, allowing them to stay awake watching a room where nothing happened, allowing them to exhaust themselves maintaining security protocols that proved unnecessary, allowing them to become complacent when the expected attack never materialized. Saturday morning, March 16th, 1935, DeMarco and O'Brien left the boarding house at approximately 9:40 ante-meridium, having spent an uncomfortable night staying alert for an attack that never came, and began walking through Harlem asking questions about Bumpy Johnson's whereabouts, visiting various businesses and clubs and pool halls where Johnson was known to spend time, showing Johnson's photograph that they'd obtained from Chicago outfit intelligence sources, offering money for information about where they could find their target. According to multiple witnesses who spoke with the Observer between March 23rd and March 30th, 1935, every person DeMarco and O'Brien approached with questions about Bumpy Johnson gave them false information, sent them to wrong addresses, directed them to locations where Johnson hadn't been in weeks, and immediately reported the 2 suspicious white men to Johnson's network, providing detailed descriptions of their appearance, their weapons, and their stated intentions. By noon on Saturday, Bumpy knew exactly where DeMarco and O'Brien had been, what questions they'd been asking, what information they'd been given, and most importantly, he knew they would be returning to the boarding house that evening, frustrated and tired after spending all day searching unsuccessfully for a man who'd been following their movements from a safe distance the entire time. The deaths of DeMarco and O'Brien occurred at approximately 6:45 post-meridium on Saturday, March 16th, as they were walking back to the boarding house after a fruitless day of investigation. According to witnesses who observed the incident from windows overlooking the street, 2 cars pulled up alongside DeMarco and O'Brien on 137th Street between Lenox and 7th Avenue, a relatively quiet residential block where few people were outside at that particular moment. Men emerged from both cars, at least 6 men total according to witnesses, armed with shotguns and pistols, and opened fire on DeMarco and O'Brien at close range before the Chicago assassins could draw their own weapons or run for cover. The shooting lasted approximately 15 seconds, during which witnesses estimated that at least 30 shots were fired, leaving both DeMarco and O'Brien dead on the sidewalk, their bodies riddled with bullet wounds, their weapons still holstered, their money and identification taken by Johnson's men, who searched the bodies quickly before getting back into the cars and driving away before police could respond to reports of gunfire. The double murder on 137th Street created a major police investigation, but as with the Moretti killing, nobody in Harlem admitted to seeing anything useful. Nobody could identify the shooters, nobody wanted to cooperate with police investigating the deaths of 2 white men who'd been walking around the neighborhood all day, asking questions that made it obvious they were criminals from out of town looking for someone to kill. The police investigation stalled within days, classified as an unsolved gang killing that would remain open but inactive in departmental files. According to Theodore Green, this was exactly what Bumpy wanted. Police attention that wouldn't lead anywhere, media coverage that would report the deaths without understanding their significance, and most importantly, news that would eventually reach Al Capone in Chicago, informing him that 3 of his 17 assassins were dead within 48 hours of arriving in Harlem, killed by an organization that was better informed, better prepared, and more ruthless than Capone had anticipated. Monday, March 18th, 1935, brought the 4th through 7th assassins to New York. Robert Bobby Knuckles Santelli, 32 years old, Michael Mickey Guns Torino, 36 years old, Joseph Joey the Snake Colombo, 29 years old, and Carlo the Hammer Benedetto, 41 years old, arrived on the morning train from Chicago at 8:20 ante-meridiem, checking into the Hotel Teresa as businessmen visiting New York for legitimate purposes, spending Monday afternoon separately scouting locations where Bumpy Johnson had been reported to conduct business, gathering in one of their hotel rooms Monday evening to compare notes and plan their approach for locating and killing a target who had so far proven extremely elusive. According to sources within the Chicago outfit who later provided information to organized crime historians, these four men represented some of Capone's most capable operatives, experienced killers who'd survived years of gang warfare through a combination of caution, violence, and tactical intelligence that had kept them alive when dozens of their contemporaries had been killed by rivals or arrested by police. What Santelli, Torino, Colombo, and Benedetto discovered during their Monday reconnaissance was deeply troubling, according to accounts they sent back to Chicago via telegram Monday evening. Every person they approached with questions about Bumpy Johnson either claimed not to know who he was, or gave them obviously false information, or told them that Johnson had left New York weeks earlier and wasn't currently in Harlem, or became hostile and suggested the four white men leave the neighborhood before something unfortunate happened to them. More disturbing, according to the telegrams, was the sense that they were being watched constantly, that people on the street were paying attention to their movements. That information about their presence in Harlem was spreading faster than they could move through different locations, and that the man they were supposed to kill almost certainly knew they were looking for him and was preparing some kind of response. The telegrams requested guidance from Frank Nitti about whether they should continue the mission given the hostile intelligence environment, or whether they should return to Chicago and report that Harlem was more difficult territory than the outfit had anticipated. Nitti's response, according to Chicago outfit records, was uncompromising. Complete the mission regardless of difficulties. Kill Bumpy Johnson. Do not return to Chicago until the target is dead. Al Capone's reputation depends on eliminating this threat and demonstrating that nobody who steals from the outfit or disrespects our organization survives the consequences. The four men received Nitti's orders Tuesday morning, March 19th, and according to later accounts, made the decision that they would attempt to ambush Johnson at his office above the grocery store on Lenox Avenue, a location they'd identified through their reconnaissance as a place where Johnson spent significant time and where he might be vulnerable to a coordinated assault by multiple armed men attacking simultaneously from different directions. The plan was sound in theory. The four assassins would approach the grocery store from different directions Tuesday evening, posing as ordinary pedestrians. At exactly 7:30 post-meridium, when Johnson was likely to be in his office conducting business, they would simultaneously enter the building, fight their way past any guards or associates, and kill Johnson before he could escape or organize a defense. The plan failed in practice because Bumpy Johnson knew about it approximately 6 hours before it was scheduled to happen. Having been informed by his network that four white men had been asking specific questions about the grocery store, about its entrances and exits, about what time Bumpy typically arrived and left, about how many people worked there and whether they were armed, questions that made it obvious the four men were planning some kind of attack on that location. Tuesday, March 19th, 1935, 7:15 post-meridium. Bumpy Johnson was not at his office above the grocery store when Santelli, Torino, Colombo, and Benedetto began their synchronized approach to the building. Instead, he was 3 blocks away with 12 of his most dangerous enforcers, watching through binoculars as the 4 Chicago assassins moved into position around the grocery store, communicating through hand signals as they prepared to enter the building and kill a target who wasn't there but who knew exactly where they were. At 7:31 post-meridium, approximately 60 seconds after the 4 assassins entered the grocery store building and discovered that Bumpy's office was empty, that the entire second floor was empty except for some furniture and business records, that they'd walked into what was obviously a trap, Bumpy's men surrounded the building, blocking all exits, and began shooting through the windows with such overwhelming firepower that the 4 Chicago killers had no opportunity to escape or fight back effectively. According to witnesses who observed the assault from nearby buildings, the shooting lasted approximately 4 minutes, during which Bumpy's men fired hundreds of rounds into the grocery store building, using not just pistols but also shotguns, and even a Thompson submachine gun that one of Johnson's associates had acquired specifically for this operation, creating a level of violence that was shocking even for Harlem in 1935, where gang shootings were relatively common, but usually involved a few shots rather than sustained automatic weapons fire. When the shooting stopped, Bumpy's men entered the building and found all 4 Chicago assassins dead, their bodies torn apart by the massive amount of gunfire that had struck them, their weapons barely used because they'd had almost no opportunity to return fire against attackers who'd positioned themselves outside the building and who'd maintained such overwhelming volume of fire that the 4 men inside had been forced to stay behind cover trying to survive rather than attempting any offensive response. The grocery store shooting created enormous police attention, with homicide detectives spending days investigating what appeared to be a massacre, trying to identify the 4 dead white men, trying to understand why they'd been in that building, trying to locate witnesses willing to testify about who had carried out the attack. As with the previous killings, the investigation produced no useful results. The 4 bodies remained unidentified for weeks because Bumpy's men had removed all identification and personal effects before police arrived. No witnesses admitted to seeing the actual shooting, despite the fact that it occurred on a busy commercial street where dozens of people were present. The weapons used in the attack vanished into Harlem's underground networks, never to be recovered by authorities. The police investigation eventually concluded that the 4 unidentified men had been involved in some kind of criminal enterprise that led to their execution by unknown assailants, a conclusion that was accurate but completely unhelpful for actually solving the murders or identifying who was responsible. By Wednesday, March 20th, 1935, 7 of Al Capone's 17 assassins were dead, killed within 6 days of arriving in Harlem by an organization that had demonstrated both superior intelligence capabilities and the tactical sophistication to turn every assassination attempt into an opportunity to kill the would-be killers. According to sources in Chicago who later spoke with The Observer, Frank Nitti began receiving fragmentary reports Wednesday morning about men who'd been sent to kill Bumpy Johnson but who'd stopped communicating, about telegrams that were no longer being answered, about concerns from the remaining assassins who were in New York but who were reporting that the situation in Harlem was far more dangerous than they'd been led to believe. Nitti apparently attempted to keep information about the failures from reaching Capone immediately, hoping that some of the remaining 10 assassins would manage to complete the mission and restore the outfit's reputation before Capone learned how badly the operation was failing. The remaining 10 assassins were in New York by Wednesday evening, having arrived in smaller groups throughout the week, and Nitti sent urgent communications Wednesday night instructing them to coordinate their efforts, to work together as a unified team rather than as individual operators, to use their combined strength and experience to locate and kill Bumpy Johnson before the situation deteriorated further. The 10 men, according to later accounts, met at a warehouse on the Lower East Side that was controlled by associates of Lucky Luciano who were sympathetic to the Chicago outfit's desire to eliminate Johnson, despite the fact that Luciano himself had reached an accommodation with Johnson after Dutch Schultz's death and preferred to maintain stable relationships with Harlem's indigenous criminal operators rather than starting new wars. The 10 remaining assassins were, according to Chicago outfit records, Antonio "Tony the Blade" Ricci, 38 years old, an expert with knives who'd killed at least 15 men in close-quarters combat; Charles "Charlie" Boxcar Morgan, 42 years old, a former railroad worker who'd become one of Capone's most reliable enforcers for dealing with labor disputes; Giovanni "Johnny the Hammer" Rossini, 33 years old, a brutal killer known for using hammers and blunt instruments to beat victims to death; Marco the Mauler Bellini, 39 years old, a massive man who stood 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighed over 260 pounds, skilled in bare-handed fighting and known for crushing opponents with his physical strength; Salvatore Sally Gunshots Romano, 31 years old, an expert marksman who'd killed at least a dozen men with precise long-distance rifle shots; Edward Eddie the Torch Gallagher, 35 years old, an arson specialist, who'd burned down buildings and killed people by trapping them in structures he'd set ablaze; Francis Frankie Bones Morello, 40 years old, a sadistic torturer who enjoyed inflicting pain and who'd been involved in numerous kidnappings and executions; Leonard Lenny the Ape Caruso, 37 years old, another physically imposing enforcer known for extreme brutality; Vincent Vinny Deadeye Scarpetti, 34 years old, a calm and methodical killer who approached murder as a professional craft requiring precision and planning, and Albert "Albie the Rat" DeLuca, 29 years old, the youngest of the group but also one of the most vicious, having killed his first man at age 17 and having murdered at least 20 people by age 29. These 10 men represented, according to organized crime historians, approximately 1% of the Chicago outfit's total enforcement capacity, but a much higher percentage of its most experienced and dangerous killers, men who'd survived years of gang warfare during Chicago's most violent period. Men who Capone believed could accomplish together what 7 individual assassins or small groups had failed to accomplish separately. The plan the 10 men developed Wednesday night was to ambush Bumpy Johnson at the Cotton Club on Thursday evening, March 21st, using information that Johnson frequently visited the club on Thursday nights to collect protection payments and to meet with various associates. The 10 assassins would position themselves throughout the Cotton Club, pretending to be ordinary patrons enjoying the entertainment, and would wait for Johnson to arrive. Once Johnson was inside and distracted by whatever business he was conducting, the 10 men would simultaneously draw their weapons and kill Johnson, along with anyone who tried to protect him, overwhelming any resistance through sheer firepower and numbers. What the 10 Chicago assassins didn't know, what they couldn't have known because the information was kept secret until years later, was that Bumpy Johnson's network had penetrated the warehouse meeting on Wednesday night through an informant who was present during the planning session, who listened to the entire strategy discussion, and who reported every detail to Johnson within 2 hours of the meeting concluding. By Thursday morning, March 21st, Bumpy knew that 10 assassins were planning to attack him at the Cotton Club that evening, knew what time they would arrive, knew that they planned to position themselves throughout the venue, and knew that they intended to kill him through overwhelming firepower. Armed with this information, Johnson developed what associates later described as the most audacious and psychologically devastating response of the entire conflict with the Chicago outfit. Thursday, March 21st, 1935, 8:45 post-meridium. The Cotton Club was crowded with approximately 300 patrons enjoying performances by Duke Ellington's orchestra, completely unaware that 10 Chicago assassins were scattered throughout the venue, sitting at different tables, standing at the bar, positioned near exits, all watching the entrance and waiting for Bumpy Johnson to arrive so they could kill him in the most public and violent display possible. At 8:53 post-meridium, the lights in the Cotton Club suddenly went dark, plunging the venue into complete blackness, cutting off Duke Ellington's performance mid-song, triggering confusion and alarm among patrons who couldn't understand what had happened to the electricity. In the darkness, according to witnesses who survived what happened next, gunshots erupted throughout the Cotton Club, muzzle flashes creating brief moments of illumination that revealed scenes of chaos and violence as Bumpy Johnson's men, who had been positioned throughout the venue disguised as waiters, bartenders, and musicians, opened fire on the 10 Chicago assassins whose positions had been identified earlier in the day through Johnson's intelligence network. The shooting in the dark lasted approximately 90 seconds, during which more than 200 rounds were fired according to later police estimates based on bullet holes and recovered casings, creating panic among innocent patrons who dove under tables or ran toward exits trying to escape the gunfire without understanding who was shooting at whom or why the Cotton Club had suddenly become a battlefield. When the lights came back on at 8:56 post-meridium, controlled by one of Bumpy's associates who'd cut the power deliberately to create cover for the ambush, the Cotton Club was a scene of absolute carnage. All 10 Chicago assassins were dead or dying, their bodies sprawled across tables, slumped against walls, collapsed on the dance floor, riddled with bullet wounds from the concentrated fire that Bumpy's men had directed at them during the 90-second blackout. Several innocent patrons had been wounded by stray bullets, though miraculously nobody except the 10 intended targets had been killed, a fact that witnesses attributed to Bumpy's insistence that his men focus their fire only on the Chicago killers and avoid shooting randomly into crowds despite the darkness and confusion. Bumpy Johnson himself, according to witnesses, had not been in the Cotton Club when the shooting started. He'd been outside on the street, watching the entrance, waiting to see if the 10 assassins would actually attempt their planned attack, and he entered the venue only after the shooting had stopped, walking calmly through the chaos of wounded patrons, screaming, police sirens approaching, bodies bleeding on the floor, appearing completely composed despite the violence that had just occurred in a space where he'd been expected to die. According to Rebecca Hartford, the Cotton Club waitress who'd witnessed the original confrontation between Bumpy and Big Tony Marcello, Bumpy surveyed the dead Chicago assassins with no visible emotion, then addressed the Cotton Club staff and the remaining conscious patrons with a brief statement. These men came from Chicago to kill me because I embarrassed Al Capone and took his money. They failed. Any other men Capone sends will fail. Harlem protects its own, and nobody from Chicago or anywhere else can operate here without my permission. Anyone who was injured tonight will have their medical expenses paid by my organization. Anyone who saw what happened tonight would be wise to forget the details when police ask questions, because the men who did this shooting work for me, and I protect the people who protect me. By Thursday midnight, March 21st, 1935, 16 of Al Capone's 17 assassins were dead, killed over the course of 1 week in a series of ambushes, shootouts, and coordinated attacks that demonstrated Bumpy Johnson's complete dominance of Harlem's criminal landscape and his ability to destroy any threat regardless of how powerful or experienced the attacking organization might be. The 17th assassin, according to accounts that emerged later, never attempted to kill Bumpy Johnson at all, having witnessed enough of what happened to his colleagues to understand that the mission was impossible and that returning to Chicago alive was more important than dying for Al Capone's wounded pride. The 17th assassin was Tommy Careful Benedetti, 39 years old in March 1935, a Chicago outfit enforcer whose nickname derived from his reputation for cautious planning and his refusal to take unnecessary risks, traits that had kept him alive through years of gang warfare that had killed many of his less careful associates. Benedetti arrived in New York on Tuesday, March 19th, checked into a hotel in Midtown Manhattan rather than Harlem, and spent several days observing the neighborhood from a safe distance, trying to gather information about Bumpy Johnson's whereabouts and routines without exposing himself to the kind of detection that had gotten his colleagues killed. What Benedetti observed during his reconnaissance convinced him that the mission was suicidal, that Bumpy Johnson controlled Harlem so completely that any assassination attempt would be detected and neutralized before it could succeed, and that returning to Chicago and reporting this reality to Al Capone was preferable to dying uselessly in New York. According to sources who later spoke with organized crime historians, Benedetti made contact with Bumpy Johnson on Friday, March 22nd, through intermediaries, requesting a meeting to discuss a matter of mutual interest. The meeting occurred that afternoon at a restaurant in Harlem, where Benedetti, according to witnesses, explained to Johnson that he'd been sent by Al Capone to kill him, but that after observing what had happened to 16 other assassins, Benedetti had decided that personal survival was more important than completing an impossible mission. Benedetti proposed a deal. He would return to Chicago and deliver a message to Capone personally. A message directly from Bumpy Johnson, explaining the situation and clarifying the terms under which Capone should consider the matter settled. In exchange, Johnson would allow Benedetti to leave New York alive and would provide information that Benedetti could use to explain to Capone why 16 professional killers had failed to complete their assignment. Bumpy Johnson, according to Theodore Green, who was present during the meeting, agreed to Benedetti's proposal, recognizing that having a survivor return to Chicago to deliver a personal message would be more effective at deterring future attacks than simply killing all 17 assassins and leaving Capone to wonder what had happened to them. The message Johnson sent through Benedetti was, according to multiple sources, carefully crafted to be both diplomatic and threatening, acknowledging Capone's power while making clear that power didn't extend to Harlem, and that any future attempts to challenge Johnson's authority in his home territory would result in the same outcome that had just cost the Chicago outfit 16 experienced men. The message, as recorded by associates who heard Johnson dictate it, read as follows: Mr. Capone, I respect your organization and your reputation. Chicago belongs to you, and I would never presume to challenge your authority in your territory. But Harlem belongs to me. When your man Tony Marcello came to the Cotton Club and disrespected my people, I responded the way any man would respond to protect his reputation and his authority. I took the money he was carrying because disrespect has costs, and I sent him back to you with a message that apparently wasn't clear enough. You responded by sending 17 men to kill me. 16 of them are dead now, killed by my organization in my neighborhood where I have advantages you can't overcome no matter how many men you send. The 17th man, Thomas Benedetti, is alive only because he was smart enough to realize the mission was impossible and because I'm allowing him to return to Chicago to deliver this message personally. Consider this matter settled. I keep the $75,000. You accept that Harlem is my territory, not yours, and that I won't tolerate Chicago operators conducting business here without my permission. If you accept these terms, there will be no further conflict between our organizations. If you send more men to kill me, they will die, just like the first 16 died, and eventually you'll run out of men before I run out of ammunition and home field advantage. Choose wisely, Mr. Capone. Harlem isn't Chicago, and I'm not someone you can intimidate or eliminate through violence. Sincerely, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. Thomas Benedetti left New York on Sunday, March 24, 1935, carrying Bumpy Johnson's written message, carrying detailed information about how 16 Chicago assassins had been killed through superior intelligence and tactical planning, and carrying the personal understanding that Bumpy Johnson was far more dangerous and far more intelligent than anyone in the Chicago outfit had anticipated. Benedetti arrived in Chicago on Monday, March 25th, went directly to the Lexington Hotel, and requested an immediate meeting with Al Capone to deliver information about the New York operation that required Capone's urgent attention. According to sources present during the meeting, Capone listened to Benedetti's account with increasing anger and disbelief, unable to accept that 16 of his best men had been killed by a Harlem gangster he'd dismissed as an upstart who could be eliminated through overwhelming force. Capone demanded details about how the men had died, how Bumpy Johnson had managed to detect and kill professional assassins who should have been able to complete their mission through sheer numbers and experience. Benedetti explained about Johnson's intelligence network, about how every person in Harlem apparently reported to Johnson about suspicious white men asking questions, about how Johnson seemed to know where each assassin was and what they were planning before they could even locate him, about how Johnson had turned each assassination attempt into an opportunity to kill the assassins, about the final massacre at the Cotton Club where 10 men had been killed simultaneously in a coordinated ambush that demonstrated tactical planning beyond what anyone had expected from a black gangster operating in a relatively small neighborhood. Capone's response, according to sources, was initially rage at Benedetti for surviving when 16 other men had died, suspicion that Benedetti might be exaggerating Johnson's capabilities to excuse his own failure to complete the mission, demands that Benedetti return to New York and complete the assignment regardless of difficulties. But as Benedetti provided more details, showed Capone the written message from Johnson, explained the practical realities of trying to operate in hostile territory where the target controlled all intelligence and had unlimited support from the local population, Capone's anger gradually shifted from Benedetti to a broader understanding that the situation in Harlem was fundamentally different from anything the Chicago outfit had encountered before. According to Frank Nitti, who spoke with associates years later about the meeting, Capone eventually accepted that continuing to send assassins to Harlem would only result in more deaths and more damage to the outfit's reputation, that Bumpy Johnson had demonstrated capabilities that made him genuinely dangerous despite operating in a relatively small territory, and that the $75,000 lost to Johnson was a painful but manageable cost compared to the potential costs of an extended conflict that the outfit might not win. Capone decided, according to Nitti, to let the matter drop, to accept Johnson's message that Harlem was off-limits to Chicago operations, and to focus the outfit's attention on territories where they could operate more successfully without facing the kind of intelligence networks and community support that made Johnson nearly impossible to kill in his home neighborhood. The decision to end the conflict was never publicly announced, never formalized through any written agreement, but became apparent through the Chicago outfit's actions over the following weeks and months. No additional assassins were sent to kill Bumpy Johnson. No attempts were made to retaliate for the deaths of 16 Chicago enforcers. The $75,000 remained with Johnson, representing both a financial loss and a symbolic acknowledgement that Johnson had won the conflict and established his authority over Harlem in ways that even Al Capone had to respect. The Chicago outfit continued operating in various cities across America, but Harlem remained firmly under Bumpy Johnson's control, protected from outside criminal organizations through the combination of intelligence, violence, and community support that Johnson had demonstrated so effectively during the week when he destroyed Capone's assassination attempts. The long-term consequences of the failed assassination campaign were significant for both organizations. For Al Capone and the Chicago outfit, the loss of 16 experienced enforcers in a single week represented both a practical reduction in their operational capabilities and a psychological blow to their reputation as the most powerful criminal organization in America. Other criminal organizations, observing that Capone had failed to eliminate a Harlem gangster despite sending 17 assassins, became less intimidated by Chicago's threats and more willing to resist outfit expansion into their territories. Capone's image as an unstoppable force in American organized crime suffered permanent damage, contributing to the broader decline of his influence that culminated in his imprisonment for tax evasion in 1932 and his eventual death from syphilis-related complications in 1947. The 16 men who died in Harlem were replaced eventually, but the lesson of their deaths, that superior numbers and experience meant nothing against superior intelligence and home field advantage, was never forgotten within the outfit. For Bumpy Johnson, the successful defense against Capone's assassination attempts established his reputation as not just a dangerous local gangster, but as someone capable of outsmarting and outfighting the most powerful criminal organization in America. The story of how Johnson killed 16 Chicago assassins in 1 week spread throughout the American underworld, making Johnson's name known far beyond Harlem, creating a legend that would sustain his authority for decades, and that would make other criminal organizations extremely cautious about challenging him in his territory. Johnson used the $75,000 taken from Tony Marcello to expand his numbers operations, to strengthen his intelligence networks, and to provide benefits to the Harlem community that reinforced his position as both a criminal and a protector of black interests against outside exploitation. The Cotton Club Massacre, as the March 21st shooting became known in Harlem, created enormous police pressure to solve the murders of 10 unidentified white men who'd been killed in one of the neighborhood's most prominent entertainment venues. But, as with the previous killings of Chicago assassins, the investigation produced no useful results. Nobody admitted to witnessing the actual shooting, despite 300 people being present in the club when the lights went dark. Nobody could identify the gunmen, despite the fact that they'd been working as Cotton Club employees for days leading up to the attack. No weapons were recovered, no witnesses were willing to testify. The investigation remained open for years, but never produced arrests or indictments, becoming another unsolved gang killing in a city where such murders were unfortunately common during the 1930s. According to Reverend James Mitchell, a Harlem minister who knew Bumpy Johnson personally and who spoke with The Observer in April 1935, the Cotton Club Massacre became a source of pride within the black community, not because of the violence itself, but because it demonstrated that black gangsters could defend their territory against white criminal organizations that had historically treated black neighborhoods as territories to be exploited without resistance. The fact that Bumpy had outsmarted Al Capone, had killed 16 Chicago enforcers, had sent a clear message that Harlem wasn't for sale, resonated with people who'd spent their lives being told that white power was absolute and unchallengeable. Bumpy became a folk hero, the man who stood up to Al Capone and won, the man who proved that intelligence and local knowledge could overcome superior resources when the fight was on home ground. Margaret Holbrook, the social observer who'd witnessed the original Cotton Club confrontation between Bumpy and Tony Marcello, offered a different perspective when interviewed by The Observer on April 3, 1935. The fact that Bumpy Johnson could kill 16 men in 1 week, could orchestrate the Cotton Club Massacre, could outsmart the Chicago outfit so completely, demonstrates both his brilliance and the fundamental lawlessness that characterized Harlem in the 1930s. The police couldn't protect anyone from organized crime. The federal government wasn't interested in protecting black neighborhoods from white criminals. So people like Bumpy filled the vacuum, protecting their communities through violence that was horrifying but arguably necessary given the alternatives. What happened in March 1935 wasn't something to celebrate, but it was something to study if we want to understand how organized crime actually works in neighborhoods where legitimate authority has failed or never existed in the first place. Thomas Benedetti, the sole survivor of Capone's 17 assassins, never returned to New York after delivering Bumpy Johnson's message to Al Capone in March 1935. According to Chicago outfit records, Benedetti continued working for the organization until his death in 1942 during an unrelated gang conflict, and he reportedly told associates that his decision to negotiate with Bumpy Johnson, rather than attempting to kill him, was the smartest choice he ever made, because Johnson would certainly have killed him just as efficiently as Johnson had killed the other 16 men if Benedetti had been foolish enough to try completing the impossible mission. The final accounting of the conflict between Al Capone and Bumpy Johnson, as recorded by organized crime historians who later studied the incident, was devastatingly one-sided. Chicago sent 17 assassins to Harlem. 16 were killed within 1 week. One survived only by negotiating surrender. Chicago lost $75,000 that was never recovered. Chicago's reputation as an unstoppable criminal organization was permanently damaged. Harlem remained under Bumpy Johnson's control without interruption. Johnson's reputation was enhanced throughout the American underworld. The only winner was Johnson, who demonstrated that Harlem couldn't be conquered by outside organizations regardless of their power or resources elsewhere. The story of Al Capone's failed assassination campaign against Bumpy Johnson became one of the most discussed incidents in organized crime history, studied by historians as an example of how territorial conflicts between criminal organizations could be decided not by superior firepower, but by superior intelligence, local knowledge, and the support of a community that viewed one side as protectors and the other side as invaders. The story was told and retold in Harlem for decades, becoming part of the neighborhood's collective memory about the time when their champion defeated America's most famous gangster, when Bumpy Johnson proved that black gangsters could compete with white crime syndicates on equal terms and win decisively when fighting on ground they controlled. Bumpy Johnson never publicly discussed the details of how he killed 16 Chicago assassins in March 1935. When contacted by the Observer requesting comment for this story, Johnson declined through his attorney Theodore Green, who issued a written statement on March 30, 1935. Mr. Johnson has no knowledge of any conflict with Chicago criminal organizations. Mr. Johnson is a Harlem businessman who focuses on legitimate enterprises and who has no involvement in violence or illegal activities. If criminals from Chicago or elsewhere have experienced difficulties while visiting New York, Mr. Johnson suggests they discuss their problems with appropriate law enforcement authorities rather than making unfounded allegations against respected members of the Harlem community. Mr. Johnson supports peaceful resolution of all conflicts and believes that people from different cities should treat each other with mutual respect when conducting business in unfamiliar territories. But among Johnson's associates, friends, and the broader Harlem community, there was no ambiguity about what had happened or why it mattered. Al Capone sent 17 killers to murder Bumpy Johnson in March 1935. 16 died within 1 week, killed by an organization that was smarter, better informed, and more ruthless than Capone had anticipated. One survivor returned to Chicago carrying Bumpy's message that Harlem wasn't for sale and wasn't part of any criminal empire except the one that Harlem's own gangsters had built through decades of fighting for control of their neighborhood. The message was received, understood, and never challenged again by the Chicago outfit or by any other outside organization that considered trying to operate in Harlem without Bumpy Johnson's permission. The Cotton Club reopened 2 weeks after the massacre, after extensive repairs to bullet damage and after the management implemented new security procedures designed to prevent similar incidents. Duke Ellington returned to perform, the dancers returned to the stage, the wealthy white patrons returned to enjoy Harlem's exotic entertainment, and the club continued operating successfully until it closed in 1940. But everyone who worked at the Cotton Club, everyone who performed there, everyone who patronized the venue after March 21, 1935, understood that the club existed only because Bumpy Johnson allowed it to exist, that Harlem's entertainment industry operated under Johnson's protection, and that anyone who threatened that arrangement would face the same fate as the 16 Chicago assassins whose bodies had been carried out of the Cotton Club that Thursday night, when the lights came back on and revealed the price of challenging Bumpy Johnson in his home territory. The lesson Al Capone learned, the lesson that Thomas Benedetti carried back to Chicago in March 1935, the lesson that spread throughout American organized crime in the months and years following the failed assassination campaign, was simple and absolute. Bumpy Johnson couldn't be killed in Harlem. His intelligence networks were too extensive, his tactical planning was too sophisticated, his community support was too strong, his willingness to use extreme violence was too demonstrated. Any organization that wanted to operate in Harlem had to work with Bumpy or stay out of Harlem entirely, because the alternative was what happened to Capone's 17 assassins, 16 deaths, and 1 humiliating surrender, broadcast to every gangster in America as proof that even the mighty Chicago outfit couldn't defeat a Harlem gangster who controlled his territory completely and who refused to bow to any power except his own judgment about what was best for his neighborhood and his organization. That was the real message of March 1935. The message that defined Bumpy Johnson's legacy for the next 33 years until his death in 1968. Harlem protected its own. Bumpy protected Harlem. And anyone who forgot those facts, anyone who came to Harlem thinking their power elsewhere meant power in that particular neighborhood, learned the lesson the hard way. The way 16 Chicago assassins learned it during 1 week when Al Capone discovered that sending killers to murder Bumpy Johnson was easy, but bringing those killers home alive was impossible.